Okay. Welcome and thank you all so much for joining. My name is Alana Harold and I am the Social Science Specialist for the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the 6th National Climate Assessment, or NCA 6, and to discuss opportunities for social scientists to contribute and become authors. The webinar should help social scientists determine if they want to answer the call for NCA 6 authors, which is currently underway with a deadline of June 7th. We have the NCA 5 Social Systems and Justice Chapter Federal Coordinating Lead Author, Keely Maxwell, and 2 NCA 5 authors, Jennifer Helgeson from the Adaptation Chapter and Mike Mendez from the Southwest Chapter, here to speak about their experiences. And we are actually quite fortunate today to be joined. It was just announced that Ariella Zeikerman will be the 6th NCA director, and we have her here to say a few words. She's a social scientist herself and has been involved in USGCRP activities as well as the National Climate Assessment for many years. So Ariella, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ariella Zeikerman, and I am the director of the NCA 6. This is my first day on the job, and I can't think of a more appropriate way to kick it off. I'm an environmental anthropologist trained scholar, and I have been working with social sciences in the NCA and USGCRP for many, many years. NCA 5 made some huge strides in incorporating social science into the assessment, not in small part because of the people who are on this call. I'd like to encourage all of you to consider putting your names or the names of your colleagues in as potential participants in the NCA 6. It's great to keep the momentum up for social sciences, and we're really looking forward to meeting you and getting to spend time with you. So have a great webinar and be in touch.
Thank you so much, Ariella. And now I will turn it over to Eliza Lustig, who is the National Climate Assessment Senior Staff Manager, to go over some USGCRP and National Climate Assessment basics.
Thank you so much, Alana. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Eliza Lustig, and as Alana said, I'm the Senior Manager on the National Climate Assessment team. Next slide, please. So I want to ground us a little bit in some of the background behind the National Climate Assessment, beginning first with the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which produces the report. So USGCRP, as we call it, was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to do exactly as it says on this slide, to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 different federal agencies to advance global change science, all of whom are depicted here on the slide. Next slide, please. So that same law that mandates the existence of the program also mandates the existence of the National Climate Assessment. That is a quadrennial report that assesses the findings of the program and the broader scientific community. The report documents what we know about global change, as well as some of the major uncertainties and what we don't know. The law requires us to look at 8 different sector areas that are listed here on the slide. That includes, of course, human social systems, as well as coupled human and ecological systems across the board. And then we are charged with assessing current trends, that is observations until the present, as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. Next slide. Okay, so now let's get into some of the specifics. To begin, NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. That includes physical science, it includes social science across disciplines, it includes indigenous knowledge, local knowledge. It all together gets synthesized, and then authors examine their confidence in their scientific understanding, as well as, like I said before, examining uncertainties. Next, the NCA is designed to be policy relevant, so we're asking our authors to distill their findings into language that is accessible to a general audience and framed in terms of risk to people and into important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive, so we do not tell people what to do. We do not advocate for a particular viewpoint or policy measure. And in that same light, we are providing a range of future projections, not a single value for people to base their decisions off of, but rather the full extent of possible risk. And then we leave it up to the decision maker to determine their own risk threshold. The assessment is fully compliant with all applicable laws and policies. Of course, that includes the Global Change Research Act, but there are other laws about things like information quality and accessibility and transparency, etc. And then finally, as I'm sure our NCA authors would attest, the report involves extensive review and iteration. That includes several opportunities for public comment and engagement, as well as a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government reviews. Next slide. Okay, so there have been to date 5 national climate assessments, the first of which came out in 2001, and then the 5th assessment, which came out most recently in 2023, last fall. We are scheduled to release our next assessment in 2027, following that quadrennial mandate, although, we don't clearly over time, we haven't hit the mark every time, but this time we do plan to. All of these reports share certain things in common because they follow the same law, but they have also evolved quite a bit over time in terms of the chapter list and the areas of emphasis, the management structures, the processes we use to carry out the assessment. And many of those changes have been driven by what we hear from the public over the past few years. And so, for example, in response to public comment on the 5th National Climate Assessment, we added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. Next slide. So I'm going to talk now about public engagement in general, both what it means to be an author and then also some of the other opportunities we have right now. So to frame that up, I just want to talk about why you would engage in this to begin with. First, as you'll see, whether you decide to submit public comments or join a future workshop or become a full-fledged author, no matter what, you will be informing the national dialogue around the impacts of climate change and how the nation is responding. And this may sound grandiose, but it is actually very real. We have seen, as I said, public comment result in new chapters, changes in wholesale report framing in areas of emphasis, new authors added midway through a process, new cross-chapter connections, so on and so forth. It really does make a big difference who the authors are and the different types of public feedback that we get. Next, we want to ensure that this report represents the broadest perspective and experience of the American people. And once again, we do not want this report to just sit on a shelf collecting dust. It really is meant to be put to action. And so getting public input at this stage, at this very formative stage, again, whether you're authors or just submitting public comment, is critical. Next, we want to make sure that we are reflecting the latest science. Like past reports, this report will have, I'm sure, hundreds of authors participating, and they will cover a lot of ground. But it still stands to reason that we want to hear from the public about what the most pressing and broadest scientific basis is, building on the literature that's come out since the release of the last NCA. And then finally, and critically, to be most useful, we really need this report to reflect the needs of the user network, which includes federal, state, local decision makers. It includes tribal leaders, educators, resource managers across sectors, science communicators, journalists, and much more. So hearing from the public throughout the process helps to ensure the report will be relevant to many different types of users. So with that in mind, I want to now go to the next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about the 6th National Climate Assessment and this current call for public input. And I mean that broadly speaking. There are 4 different key elements. The first is an announcement of the overarching proposed themes for the 6th National Climate Assessment. That's our draft prospectus, and we are calling for comment. The second is the call for authors and contributors. Next, we have a call for technical inputs, and then lastly, just a notice of our planned public engagement opportunities. I'm going to speak to all 4 of these, even though I know we're here primarily to talk about what it means to be an author, but I figure I will use this opportunity to let you know about everything. So if we could go to the next slide, let's begin with the first thing, that is our draft prospectus. The draft prospectus puts out a number of overarching themes that are proposed for this report. So we propose that the report will talk about the advancements in our scientific understanding of global change and its implications. We propose that we would be talking about both current and future risks, adaptation, as well as themes such as national security, society writ large, and people, as well as how people are behaving in response to all of the impacts of climate change. We are planning to integrate equity and environmental justice throughout the report, and we're also planning to talk about mitigation. Next slide. So we really want to hear about whether these themes meet the need of the moment. And critical feedback at this early stage is truly critical, because now is the moment when we can still pivot to change focus areas, add new chapters or report elements, adjust framings, etc. So please think about whether these are the right themes to be focusing on. What is missing? What are we not hitting on that we really ought to be? And then in general, is this framework or all of these themes meeting the needs that you see out in the public and advancing the conversation on climate change? So submit your comments by June 7th, please, at contribute.globalchange.gov. All right, so next we go to our call for authors and contributors. There are many different types of roles with different responsibilities and levels of commitment, and I know that's what we're here to focus on today. So let's get into it a little bit. We are seeking contributors from disciplines across the board, from career stages, from different career stages, different backgrounds. And so I want to start with what it means to be an author and a contributor from a high level. First of all, this is a volunteer position, so we're looking for folks with experts in topics related to climate science and global change. But please, when I say climate science, I really do mean to be inclusive of the social sciences here. As Ariella said, we really expanded our inclusion of social science and social scientists in the last assessment, and we intend to do so in this round again. We have also done well to increase our inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and author representation on the last assessment, and we want to do that. We want to do that this time as well, continue that trend. When you submit, we want to document your subject matter expertise, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And, I would just end this slide by saying that when you're doing this work, it is truly a critical service to the United States. We are informing policy, and we've seen this report put to use in so many different ways. And what I've heard from folks who have participated in the past is that it's also an opportunity to expand your networks, to meet people from across disciplines, and not only just in different disciplines, but in different lines of work entirely, all kind of focused on this issue. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number of different roles. There are 5 different types of contributors on each team. The federal coordinating lead author is selected by our steering committee, and so the remaining participant roles are all selected from the nominations via the current notice that is out for contribution. So chapter leads, who kind of are overseeing the development of an individual chapter. We have chapter authors, who are doing a lot of the writing, reviewing the literature, developing content for a single chapter. We have a graphics development lead, which is a brand new role dedicated to leading and managing the development of graphics, as well as technical contributors who are in charge of contributing to very discrete, specific content on an as needed basis. Next slide. So as I've emphasized, there are a lot of different types of topical expertise that we're looking for here: climate science, social science, Indigenous scholarship, folks who have experience in specific sectors. That can be anything named by the Global Change Research Act, whether it is the natural environment or agriculture, energy production and use, land cover, land use change, forests, coasts, oceans, marine resources, transportation, human health and welfare, air quality, the built environment, rural communities, economics, biological diversity, so on and so forth. Really, the report covers quite a bit. And so we need topical expertise across the board. We also need regional expertise, so folks who are able to integrate across relevant natural and social science areas, kind of specific to a regional context. We need folks who are experts on mitigation, climate change mitigation and adaptation. And then anything that I haven't included, please feel included because really this is so far-reaching, whether it's architecture or finance or business or engineering, whatever, planning, whatever it is, there is a home for you here in the National Climate Assessment process. We're looking for folks who are clear and effective science writers who have experience in graphic design. Team management is really important if you're hoping to be a chapter lead. And then we are hoping that you have experience also in synthesizing, which is a big part of what it means to do assessment. Next slide. I'm going to try and speed it up because I feel like I've been going on for a while here. So when you submit your nominations, we need your full name, title, institutional affiliation, contact information. We need your area of expertise. We need your CV, short description of your qualifications. And again, this is all due by June 7th at contribute.globalchange.gov. And you can, everything you need is there. So I would just go straight to that site. Okay, I'll go over a couple last things briefly and then pass the mic. So let's go to the next slide, our call for technical inputs. Call for technical inputs is, when I say technical inputs, I'm looking for papers, compilations of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, reports of various shapes and sizes. These can be submitted anytime over the next couple years. I think that's early 2027, but the sooner you get them in, the more likely it is that authors will be able to incorporate them into their assessment. So please keep us posted and submit to contribute.globalchange.gov if there are pieces of information you want the author teams to be aware of at this time. Next, and finally, our notice of planned public engagement. Next slide. We're not going to go through all of this, but suffice to say the current call puts out a notice of all of the different public engagement activities we have planned. There are many ways to participate, whether you are submitting public comment, to becoming an author, to participating in a workshop, so on and so forth. And we really, really do want your input throughout this process, especially as a social science community who we are trying to do even better to represent this time around. So with that, I think I will close my overview and pass it over to Keely Maxwell to take it away.
All right, thank you, Ariella. Lisa, rather, sorry, too late in the day. Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly a little bit just to give you some contextual background on sort of a little bit on the very brief history of social sciences in the NCA, and then talk about my role as a federal coordinating leading author. So as I think Alana said at the beginning, there's been this slow but very steady expansion of the social sciences across national climate assessments. And this has been due to a lot of factors. There have long been calls from both the research communities as well as within federal communities for greater integration of the social sciences in climate research generally and specifically in the NCA. There's also been over the years a more emergent and very robust literature in many social science disciplines, because again, the purpose of the assessment is to assess existing literature. So there's been this emergence of new literature on really interesting themes across the board in the climate social sciences that are now there to be assessed. And so the fourth National Climate Assessment did have more social science content than before, but gaps remained, both in terms of the authorships and their expertise, as well as just content gaps across both the sectoral, regional, and response chapters. Next slide, please. So how did a social systems and justice chapter come about for NCA 5? So one of the things just internally within the federal government side is some of us analyzed social science integration in NCA 4 using social science methods such as content analysis and focus groups. And so we shared findings with USGCRP, their member agencies, and interagency committees. Along with this, there was a lot of public comments coming in through the Federal Register notice, the one that Eliza just talked about for NCA 6, it's equivalent for NCA 5. And a lot of them were saying, you know, we need more environmental justice content, we need more economics, we need more social science content. So as a result, there were 2 new chapters added, economics and social systems and justice. And then in order to actually get the authors, not just to work on these chapters, but across the board, in different types of chapters, there's a lot of author recruitment and outreach. So that was a very brief background of how we got to where we are today and why we are continuing to do specific outreach to try to recruit authors and contributors from the social sciences. Next slide. So now I'm going to actually pivot to talk about what does it mean to be a Federal Coordinating Lead Author, or FCLA. So a Federal Coordinating Lead Author, or CLA, FCLA, is really a liaison between the chapter team and federal agencies. So they have to be a Fed. I know that some folks on the call are federal employees, so this is really for you. And you have 3 main job responsibilities. First is to pick the chapter lead, which is a really fun process. Seeing the names come in through this the contribution site that Eliza mentioned, and seeing who they are and learning more about them. And then because of this little law called FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, there's a little bit of complicated coordination between federal agencies and the chapter team, who might be all feds, but is more likely to be led by a non-federal author, chapter lead, and have federal and non-federal authors, or possibly even all non-federal authors. So because of these rules set by FACA, we have to have very strict lines of communication between feds and non-feds. So the role of the CLA is to really be this liaison between the chapter team through the chapter lead, really just communicating one-to-one with the chapter lead author and the federal agencies. So this means you get to sit in on author team meetings and listen to all the cool conversations they have, but you're not supposed to tell them what to do or write the chapter yourself. The other thing that it's a lot of coordination across chapters. So you'll see here that here's the list of chapters from NCA 5. So part of our roles as CLAs, and then there's also agency chapter leads who are sort of representing the interests of individual agencies. A lot of what we did was coordinating with the other CLAs and ACLs across these other chapters. And this is really important because, again, it was the first time that we had a social systems and justice chapter. So that meant we had a lot of people coming to us and saying, hey, are you covering certain topics? Are you covering communications? Are you covering environmental justice? It also meant that we were going to them because we only had a very limited amount of chapter space to talk about social systems, justice, and climate change across the United States. So we are going to a lot of the other chapters saying, okay, you know, what are you putting in the energy chapter? Or hey, what's in Alaska? What are some examples? And really making sure that we were coordinating and had those that we could refer to other chapters. So that was really fun, getting to see and read other chapters, as well as a lot of coordination because many of with reviews. So some of the reviews that are the many reviews of an assessment are from interagency reviews. And so if, like, you know, different agencies had comments on the chapter, I might be asked to, you know, sit in and help coordinate between the chapter lead and the agencies and make sure we're clear on the comments, and also how to, you know, come to an understanding about what the response might be from the chapter author team. So that, in a very brief nutshell, is the role of a federal coordinating lead author. I highly recommend it if you're a Fed. It's a really fun role. And again, alternatively, an agency chapter lead also gets to play very similar roles. So I will pass it along to the next speaker, Jen.
Well, thank you so much, Keely. It's a pleasure to be here. And just a few short years ago, I wouldn't have imagined kind of being a participant on such a webinar. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so just who I am. I'm at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So it's part of Department of Commerce. And I'm managing our community resilience program, and also a research economist in the applied economics office within the engineering lab at NIST. So I would loosely describe myself as a behavioral economist, broadly a social scientist, really working to look at resilience to hazards, both shocks and stressors that are climate and weather induced in the built environment. And under NCA 5, or as a chapter author and a cross-chapter box author, which was also new to NCA 5. And for our agency, sort of served as a review editor on other chapters and provided public comments along the way as well. So I was recruited by our coordinating lead author and also did respond to the Federal Register notice. And as a chapter author, coordinated and wrote assigned sections, responded to public and agency comments. And I think the thing to mention is if I only knew then sort of the time commitment, all these interactions that would take place, and mostly were always very positive. Of course, I'd do it all again. So a little bit more detail if we go to the next slide. This was very exciting for my agency because actually in all the previous NCAs, no one from NIST had ever been involved, and we had 2 people in this go around. Fitting social science within the NCA framework. So I think there are some complications and difficulties. Just thinking about the risk-based framing that was mentioned at the start of the webinar, versus social scientist framing. Also perspectives on the role of social science. I think probably in NCA 5, thanks to all the wonderful work my colleagues had done to prove we needed these new chapters in NCA 5 was much less difficult, but still leaves some room for additional expansion in NCA 6. An excellent learning experience, I think, for anyone. Working on the adaptation chapter, it really is a topic where it's already a lot of interdisciplinary, almost transdisciplinary work is very typical, but really do need a lot of time to develop shared vocabulary. We were one of the chapters pinged by several other chapters. I think in future NCAs, there's a lot of work that could be done across mitigation and adaptation. Those spaces in my agency, and I think kind of more broadly, tend to be more siloed than we would like to get to really good, actionable efforts to address climate change. And of course, the hardest part is word limitations. And I had one of the largest word counts in my chapter, so it was still really, really hard. So next slide, please. I think I only have about 5 minutes. I don't want to take more than my allotted time. But I think just personally, I do want to mention kind of in this process, I think I went from early-ish career to mid-career, and just the expansion of my professional network, challenging myself to learn new perspectives, a true joy of collaboration, a few photos from when we all finally got to be together in person, not this April, but April of 2023. I will say this is a significant and very serious time commitment. So we did on my chapter have one person that came in as a chapter author and sort of ended up becoming a technical contributor just because the time was not fitting within their other demands of their schedule, just balancing responsibilities. The NCA is consensus document. So you need to compromise on certain aspects of the report to ensure all perspectives are considered. And while I have the floor, right, areas of consideration, especially for social science and NCA 6, I think increased involvement of social science artists, the public, it was wonderful to see all that involvement in NCA 5. It's exciting as there's more literature to really be considered that brings social science to the fore. That'll be great to see. And then, of course, increased coordination and interaction across chapters and topics. And I already mentioned sort of mitigation, adaptation. And of course, I lead work on community resilience. So folding that in there a little bit more deliberately is something I look forward to hopefully seeing. So please put your hat in the ring. And I'm always happy to chat with folks if they want to learn more, have specific questions. But this is such a pleasure, and thank you for having me join today. So our next speaker. All right, I guess it is up to me to introduce Dr. Michael Mendez, and please, Michael.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. You can go to the next slide. My name's Michael Mendez. I'm an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine, and also a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So as Jennifer talked about her experience as an author, I also served as an author for a regional chapter, the Southwest chapter, as well the wildfire or Western wildfire box section of the NCA, which was also new to NCA 5. And it was quite an amazing experience, particularly as an early career scholar, to be able to engage on the synthesis or consensus type of documents around the United States premier climate change assessment report, the NCAA, and how it really flows into other types of local assessments. Since we were doing regional Southwest chapter, we also were very aware of how the NCAA could be focused on subnational government assessments, such as the state of California, state of New York, and even at the county level that have their own climate assessments. So really being aware about how they all feed each other or interact with one another. And I forgot to mention, I consider myself to be a social scientist, and my research broadly looks at the intersection between climate change, public health, and environmental justice. And the last 5 or so years, I've been working on climate-induced disasters and impact to some of the most socially marginalized and stigmatized populations, such as undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants, as well as LGBTQ plus populations. So I brought in that type of research into the NCA process. But before I go into that, I really want to highlight the advances of the NCA 5 and the leadership that to have a stronger emphasis on social science, environmental justice, issues of equity, it really came from throughout the federal government, from the NCA director, Allison Crimmins, to each chapter's lead author. For example, Dave White was my lead author for the Southwest region. He's at ASU and was very aware of pushing forward of having not only a diversity of disciplines on the author team, but worldviews. And to be honest, how we all come from different positionalities, different disciplines. And within that is infused our own worldviews and our own values. And how do we knowledge those different knowledge production processes? And that was a real life example of working in a transdisciplinary manner, or what the National Science Foundation calls convergence research, where you're bringing in these different actors together, including non-academic actors, nonprofits, tribal leaders, talk to each one another to identify the best available science around climate impacts to communities that is relevant, that has data that's most relevant of those lived and embodied experience, and making this assessment accessible, both linguistically and culturally relevant, and then actionable. Being able to synthesize all that type of research that will actually be useful to policymakers at the federal, throughout the federal government, as well as the subnational governments, state and local, and of course community groups that are looking to understand the various impacts happening to their regions, and then how they could be disparate and disproportionate to some populations. Next slide. And while it was mentioned that the NCA 5 had one of the biggest innovation was this environmental or social systems and justice chapter that looked at these disparate impacts, there was also integration throughout the NCA 5 that happened through all the various public comment from the NCA 4 and the pre-NCA 5, as well as leadership and the author team itself. And there's other elements, if you look through the NCA 5, where these issues of equity and justice are throughout, public health in particular, the Southwest chapter, the tribes and indigenous people, wildfire section chapter or box really underscores how socioeconomic factors are contributing these disparate impacts. So just would also highlight that. And there's been a couple questions on the time commitment. This is a significant time commitment, more than I had ever thought, but it was definitely worth it, and I would do it again. And I hope to do it again for this or other types of consensus study reports or consensus reports. But minimum, you're thinking about 200 hours throughout the 2-year process, sometimes weekly meetings or multiple weekly meetings. And again, being able to talk to other experts on your author team in a transdisciplinary manner and bridging those sort of differences in methods and methodological perspectives. But again, it's a great opportunity to build up your networks and contribute to a living document that people are actually using. It doesn't sit just on a bookshelf or a digital file that nobody ever reads. So again, if you're looking for service to climate change issues, this is a great opportunity. So I know there's a lot of questions, so I'll hand it back over before we do the Q&A session. Thank you.